This is Macmillan here with another read aloud for you. Today I have Manfish, the story of Jacques Cousteau. This is another one of our biographies, and you probably remember that a biography is a story about someone's life. It's not an autobiography. Jacques Cousteau did not write this book, but it's about him. While we read today, we'll have a couple of new vocabulary words. Here's the first one: shimmering. Listen for that one to come up in the story. Here's another: fascinated. I got one more: villain. Listen for those as they come along in our story. We'll stop and talk about them. So here we go. Manfish, the story of Jacques Cousteau. By Jennifer Byrne, illustrated by Eric Piberet. Sounds French. Bubbles rising through the silence of the sea, silvery beads of breath from a man deep, deep down in a strange and shimmering ocean land. Do you hear the first wow word? Shimmering. A strange and shimmering ocean land. When something is shimmering, it's almost glowing with light. It is shining with a soft and wavy light, just like how light goes through water or might reflect on a pond or a puddle. That light is shimmering. A manfish. Let's see. Oh, the shimmering ocean land of swaying plants and fantastic creatures. A manfish swimming, diving into the unknown, exploring underwater worlds no one had ever seen and no one could ever have imagined. Our story starts many years before, in France, with a little baby boy born under the summer sun. His parents named him Jacques. From the very beginning, little Jacques loved water, the way it felt on his hands, his face, his body. And water made him wonder. He wondered why ships floated and why rocks sank. One day, Jacques read a story about a man who hid underwater by breathing through a long tube. Jacques tried it and discovered it was impossible. He dreamed that someday he would be able to breathe underwater for real. At night, Jacques dreamed he could fly, with the birds among the clouds, with his arms stretched out like wings. Ooh, there we go. Jacques spent his days playing, experimenting, and creating. He wrote little books that he illustrated with his own drawings, and he was fascinated with machines. Fascinated. Wow, word number 2, fascinated. He was fascinated by machines. So we've been hearing about how Jacques goes under the water and thinks about flying, and he thinks about fish, and he spent his days playing, experimenting, and creating. He even wrote books. So these are all things that he is interested in. When you are fascinated by something, you find it very interesting. You can't stop looking at it or attending to it or learning about it. You are fascinated by it. I hope you are fascinated by this story, because I know I sure was the first time I read it. He studied blueprints and built a model of a crane that was as tall as he was and actually worked. Movies fascinated Jacques too. He wanted to know how they were made, how the cameras worked, and how chemicals made pictures appear on the film. Jacques saved his allowance penny by penny until he had enough to buy a small home movie camera. The first thing he did was take it apart and then put it back together. Then he began to film everything around him. He put his brother, cousins, parents, and friends in his movies. He dressed up like a villain. There it is. Villain. He dressed up like a villain. You can probably think of some villains in stories or movies that you've experienced. A villain means the bad guy. The bad guy in a movie or a story. Someone you don't want to be around. Somebody who's not a good person. He dressed up like the villain with a painted-on mustache and made some very villainous films. Villain. Villainous. Those words sound like they have the same root. What would a villainous film be like? Think about it. You're right. It would be about a villain. It would be about people doing bad things. A villainous film would be about a bad guy. Probably a bad guy doing bad things. I don't know. Jacques was always the star, the director, and the writer, and usually the cameraman. This one's pretty cool, this picture. When Jacques finished school, he joined the French Navy. His ships sailed all around the world, and everywhere he went, he filmed what he saw. In China, he filmed men catching fish with their bare hands. They held their breath underwater for many minutes. Jacques wondered what that would be like. One day, at a beach, a friend gave Jacques a pair of goggles with rubber frames, gotta use my careful speech there, and glass to look through. Jacques wore them into the ocean. Beneath the water, he was surrounded by a silvery green forest of sea plants and fish that he had never seen before. Everything was silent and shimmering. We know that one. Silent and shimmering. It was a whole new world. When he came up, he saw cars, people, buildings, and telephone poles. Once again, he went down into the magical underwater world. At that moment, Jacques knew his life was changed forever. His eyes had been opened to the wonders of the sea. So it's a real turning point in this character's life. Jacques and his friends, Philippe and Didi, began to dive together. They experimented to see how long they could stay underwater and how deep they could go. Jacques created a waterproof case for his camera to film the amazing kingdom he and his friends were exploring beneath the surface. They were beneath the surface. They're under it. They made rubber suits to keep themselves warm and flippers to help them kick better. But Jacques wanted to stay down longer than just one breath at a time. He realized he'd need to take more air with him, enough air to explore the mysterious depths and vast expanses of the ocean. To swim through the sea as free as a fish, he wanted to become a manfish. And he began to work on just how to do it. On a warm summer day, Jacques stepped into the blue Mediterranean Sea with his new invention. He called it the aqualung. Let's try that word again. It might be a new one. Aqualung. Because aqua means water, and our lungs are the part of our body that holds the air we breathe. Below the surface, Jacques swam and glided and dove. He did flips and somersaults. He stood upside down on one finger and laughed bubbles into the sea. Jacques could breathe beneath the water. Now he could swim across miles of ocean, his body feeling what only scales had felt, his eyes seeing what only fish had seen. The water made him feel like he was flying, just like in his dreams. Jacques had done it. He had become a manfish. There he is. Jacques was ready to explore the oceans of the world. He needed a boat and found a big old wooden navy ship named Calypso. In a year, he turned it from a warship into an explorer's ship. Jacques, Philippe, and Didi gathered a crew, their aqualungs, their hopes, and their dreams, and set off to explore the inside of the sea, to film a world that no one had ever seen before. This is where it gets really cool. Here they are. On their journeys, they dove deep into a seascape of plants, green and purple prickly plants, red branchy plants, spongy plants, wispy, feathery, swaying plants, slow dancing to the rhythms of the sea. They discovered plants that could feed you, plants that could poison you, plants that looked like fish, and fish that looked like plants. That's how deep they dove. Their cameras captured camouflaged scorpionfish, ugly as toads with poisonous spines. Dorados, brilliant fish that glowed the colors of emeralds, sapphires, and rubies. Checkerboard fish with red and white checks from head to tail. Deep down, they discovered a kingdom of giant rays, fish that fly through the water with wings that swim. They came face to face with a fish as big as a truck, with long fangs, lips like giant tires, and huge saucer eyes. They called it a truckfish. On the bottom, they found pink ghost crabs with eyes on long stalks, buried so deep in the sand they looked like a garden of eyes, and flute fish with heads like horses and bodies like the shape of tubes sticking out from rocky openings, like pencils in a cup. This is probably my favorite page in the whole book. So cool. They swam with giant whales, hitched rides on sea turtles, and made friends with porpoises with shining eyes and smiling faces. They filmed fierce and frightening sharks, so strange and dangerous that Jacques and his crew had to build cages, not for the sharks, but for themselves, so that they could make their movies without being eaten. Everywhere the Calypso went, Jacques and his crew made films of what they saw. Films that played in movie theaters. Films that played on TV. Millions of people all over the world discovered the wonders of the sea for the very first time, with Jacques, Philippe, Didi, and their adventurous crew. After Jacques spent most of his life making movies about the sea, he saw something happening, something shocking. Plants that used to be alive and healthy were being poisoned. Fish were sick and dying. Jacques saw that people, without realizing it, were slowly killing the sea and its creatures by dumping garbage and poisonous chemicals into the ocean that he loved so much. Jacques knew what he had to do. He had to make movies. Movies to warn people. Movies to save the sea. Jacques also spoke to presidents, to kings and queens, to people all over the earth, asking them to help save our oceans and our planet. And he spoke to children. Jacques dreamed that someday it would be you exploring worlds never seen and never imagined. Whole new worlds, silent and shimmering. Worlds that are now yours to discover, to care for, and to love. That's the end of the story. You might remember in other biographies that we've read that there's an author's note or a page with some notes and some more facts on it. This book has one of those too. So at the very end of the book, it tells me some more facts about Jacques Cousteau and some other resources, other places I could go or things I could look at if I wanted to learn more about Jacques Cousteau. There's the Jacques Cousteau Society, there's his movies and his books, there's natural history museums. I even did a little bit of research online and I found out that, of course, this is a true book. He was the person who invented scuba diving equipment. And that's something that a lot of people do for fun right now. I know my mom and dad love to go scuba diving, and it's all because of Jacques Cousteau. Thanks very much for joining me for Manfish.